3 people in my family hurt me every day, but the worst wasn't what they did to my body. It was when I realized that, to my own mother, my pain was worth less than a stained mattress. Good morning, my dear friends across this blessed country. My name is Clara Rose Thompson, born in Tupelo, Mississippi. I've got 78 years on these shoulders, each one carrying a story that could fill a book. Today I've decided to open my heart and share something I've kept buried deep inside for almost 7 decades. You know when you hold something in for so long, it turns to stone? Well, today I'm going to break that stone into pieces and throw it away. It's not easy to talk about certain things, but maybe my story will help someone going through what I went through. Someone who feels alone like I felt. But before I continue, if you're enjoying this little chat so far, leave a like down below and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. This old lady gets curious about who's on the other side of the screen. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any stories from this chatty grandma, you hear? I was born in 1947 in a small clapboard house near the banks of the Tombigbee River. Tupelo back then was a town living on memories of the glory it once had. The old colonial houses were peeling, the cobblestone streets sinking, but it still had a sad beauty that marked me forever. Our house was a bit removed from the center. Nothing special. 3 poorly divided rooms, a yard with a cherry tree that gave fruit year-round, and a hard-packed dirt yard where chickens scratched all day long. But from the outside, my daddy made sure everything looked perfect. The facade always painted light blue, the wooden windows well-maintained, the little gate always closed as if guarding some treasure inside. My father, Joseph Thompson, worked at the cotton mill that was still operating back then. He was a tall, strong man with calloused hands and eyes that always seemed to be looking for something to criticize. He always wore clean shirts, even in the most scorching heat, and had a mustache trimmed with a precision that was frightening. In the street, he was Mr. Joe, respected, greeting everyone with that manner of an upright man. He went to church every Sunday, always sat in the same pew, sang hymns with a voice that filled the sanctuary. At home, he was someone else entirely. My mother, Josephine, was a petite woman. Her hair always pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch the skin on her face. She lived with downcast eyes, as if the floor was the most interesting thing in the world. When she wasn't cooking or washing clothes, she was cleaning. My God, how that woman cleaned. It seemed that dirt was her greatest enemy. The floor of our house was packed dirt, but she spent the entire day sweeping, as if she could transform that dirt into marble if she swept hard enough. My brother, Gerald, was 2 years older than me. From an early age, he was a carbon copy of my father. Same way of walking, same way of looking down at people, same talent for making us feel small with a short phrase. He went to school. I didn't. Girls don't need much schooling, my father would say. Just enough not to embarrass themselves and to read the Bible. And then there was me, Clara. A skinny girl with poorly made braids and homemade dresses, always a bit short because I grew quickly and fabric was expensive. At school, when they still let me go, I was invisible. I had no friends, didn't participate in games during recess. I stayed in a corner, watching other girls laugh and run, imagining what it would be like to have that freedom. At home, I learned early on to make as little noise as possible. I walked on tiptoes, spoke softly, ate without making noise with the cutlery. Any sound could irritate my father. "That girl makes noise even when she breathes," he would complain. And when my father complained, what came after was never good. Our family was known in town as the Thompsons of the Blue House. Everyone thought we were the example of a perfect family. My father at the mill, my mother taking care of the house, my brother studying to be somebody in life, and me. Well, me being a good girl who helped mother and didn't cause trouble. Nobody saw what happened when the door closed. I remember one day, I must have been about 9, when the teacher asked us to draw our family. The other children made colorful drawings with smiles and hearts. I drew 4 stick figures, all serious, separated by a large space between each one. The teacher called my mother in to talk about the drawing. "Mrs. Thompson, Clara made a strange drawing of the family. Do you think everything is okay at home?" My mother smiled that smile that never reached her eyes. "Of course, teacher. Clara has always been a girl with too much imagination. Sometimes she makes these things up, When we got home, my mother tore the drawing into tiny pieces in front of me. "Never do that again," she said, not with anger, but with fear in her eyes. "Never show anyone what happens inside this house." It was the first time I understood. What happened in our house was wrong. So wrong that it needed to be hidden. But I still didn't know how wrong. We didn't have a television, radio only sometimes, when my father allowed it. The entertainment at home was listening to the stories my grandmother told when she managed to visit us, which was rare because my father didn't like her much. Grandma Nellie was my mother's mother, a short lady with white hair and wrinkled hands that always smelled of anise. She told me stories of enchantments, of princesses who escaped from castles, of girls who transformed into little birds and flew far away. I drank in every word, imagining what it would be like to turn into a bird and fly out the window, away from that house, that life. "Grandma, are these stories real?" I asked once. She held my hands between hers, looked deep into my eyes, and said, "My child, sometimes we need to believe in things that don't exist to endure the things that do." I didn't understand at the time. Today I know exactly what she meant. In town, we were the Thompsons of the Blue House. At home, we were strangers living under the same roof. My father and brother on one side, my mother trying to please them both, and me trying to be invisible. Life followed a predictable routine. My father left early for work, returned for lunch, rested a bit, and went back to the mill. He arrived at night, ate dinner in silence, sometimes went out again to meet friends at the corner bar. When he returned late, that's when fear took over the house. My mother knew. The sound of his footsteps, stumbling on the stone path, was the signal for her to lock herself in the bedroom and pretend she was sleeping. For me, it was the signal to hide under the bed, praying he wouldn't remember I existed. Sometimes the prayers were answered. Other times, they weren't. My brother started going out with my father when he turned 15. They'd come back together from the bar, both smelling of cheap whiskey and tobacco. That's when things got worse. It wasn't just one anymore. It was two. One teaching the other to be a man, to show who was in charge of the house, and who showed them they were men. The skinny girl who was terrified of her own shadow. I had no friends, no one to tell what was happening. At school, increasingly rare for me, the other girls thought I was weird. "The strange one from the Blue House," I heard one of them say once. And it was true. I was strange. I didn't know how to play, didn't know how to truly smile, didn't know how to be a normal child. What I did know was how to survive. I knew which floorboards creaked, how to move without making noise. I knew how to identify my father's mood by the way the door shut when he arrived. I knew how to make myself small, almost non-existent, when I sensed danger was near. Oh my folks, I'm talking, and I almost forgot to say, if you're enjoying this story, as sad as it may be, leave a comment telling me where you're from. This old lady gets curious. Is someone watching from the West Coast? From the East? Tell me in the comments, and take the opportunity to leave a like and subscribe to Grandparents' Tales. I promise that despite the difficult beginning, this story has important lessons to teach. Continuing, when I was about 12, things started happening to my body. Things no one had explained to me that scared me. My mother, when she saw the blood on my underwear for the first time, just gave me some rags and said, "Now you're a young lady. You have to be even more careful." She didn't explain what I needed to be careful about, but I knew. The way my father and brother began to look at me differently told me everything I needed to know. Our house had thin walls, made of wood and plaster. You could hear everything. At night, sometimes I heard my parents talking, or rather, my father talking and my mother responding with monosyllables. "That girl is getting like your sister," he would say. My Aunt Darlene, who had run away from home at 16 with a musician passing through town. We had never heard from her again. "Need to keep a tight rein, or one of these days she'll run off with the first man that walks by." "Yes, Joe," my mother would respond. Always yes, always agreeing. I see the way men look at her on the street. They're going to say I didn't raise my daughter right. And so, the noose tightened. I couldn't go to school anymore. You already know how to read and write. What more do you need? Couldn't go to church. No man will respect a woman who shows herself around. Couldn't even sit at the door of the house to feel the evening breeze. My world kept getting smaller and smaller, until it fit only in those 3 rooms of the blue house. Outside, people must have thought I had disappeared, or gone to work in another town, or who knows what. Nobody asked. In Tupelo back then, what happened inside a house was only the business of those who lived in it. It was during this time that I began to have a recurring dream. I turned into a little bird, like in Grandma Nellie's stories, and flew out the window. I flew up and up until Tupelo was small below, until the blue house was just a tiny dot that I could barely see. And I kept flying, far away, to a place where nobody knew my name, where I could start over. I always woke up with the same tightness in my chest, the same certainty that it would never happen, that I would spend the rest of my life in that house, with those people, in that constant fear, that one day I would be like my mother, a shadow of a person, sweeping the dirt floor as if she could erase the marks that life had left on her. Until one night, when I was 13, everything changed forever. My father and brother came back from the bar earlier than usual. My mother was already locked in her room, pretending to sleep as she always did. I was in my little corner, a part of the living room separated by a hanging sheet, which was what I called a bedroom. I heard their footsteps, different from normal. They weren't stumbling as usual, they were deliberate, and they were coming my way. What happened that night is something I've tried to forget for decades. Sometimes I succeed. For days, weeks, even months. But it always comes back, in nightmares, in flashbacks when I hear a similar noise, when I smell something that reminds me of that night. What I can say is that when they finally left me alone, I was lying on the thin mattress that was my bed, looking at the ceiling, feeling a pain that went far beyond the physical. I was bleeding, trembling, in shock. I thought I was going to die right there, and for a moment I even wished it would happen. That's when I heard the door open. I turned my head with difficulty and saw my mother's silhouette against the dim light of the kerosene lamp. For an instant, a spark of hope lit up inside me. My mother was going to help me. She was going to clean me up, comfort me, maybe even take me away from there. She approached, looked at me for a moment, then turned her eyes to the blood-stained mattress. And what she said that night marked my soul in a way that no physical violence ever could. "For the love of God, look at this mess. Clean it up now before it stains the new mattress." It was at that moment that I knew. To my own mother, I was worth less than a mattress. My pain, my dignity, my entire life, all of it was worth less than an object she could buy at the store for a few dollars. That night, something died inside me. But something was also born. The certainty that one day, somehow, I would leave that blue house. Even if it was as a little bird, even if it was flying far away, where no one could reach me. After that night, I looked at myself in the broken piece of mirror I kept hidden, and no longer recognized who I was. The eyes staring back at me seemed to belong to a much older person. A 13-year-old girl with the soul of an old woman, carrying a weight that no child should carry. My mother's words echoed in my head every time I closed my eyes. "Clean it up now, before it stains the new mattress," as if the blood flowing between my legs was just any old dirt, as if what had happened to me was less important than a piece of foam covered with fabric. I cleaned everything as best I could that night. My hands were shaking so much that I spilled water on the dirt floor, creating mud that stuck to my bare feet. I used an old piece of cloth, wet in the basin we used for everything from washing dishes to bathing. The pain between my legs was like fire, but the pain inside my chest burned much more. The next morning, I woke up with an aching body, a heavy head, and a new certainty. I was completely alone in this world. I looked through the crack in the window and saw that the sky was heavy, gray, as if even God had turned his back on Tupelo that day. My mother was in the kitchen, grinding coffee in the wooden mortar with that monotonous rhythm that marked our days. Thump, thump, thump. She didn't even look at me when I entered. It was as if I were a ghost, a presence she preferred not to see. "There's grits in the pot," was all she said, without raising her eyes from the mortar. I served myself some cold grits on a cracked plate and ate in silence. Every movement hurt, not just in my body, but in my soul. The food tasted like nothing. I wondered if I would ever taste anything again. My father and brother had left early for the mill. I thanked God silently for that. I didn't know how I would look at them after what happened. I didn't know if I could be in the same space as them without screaming, until I lost my voice. In the days that followed, a new routine was established in our house. A silent routine, based on averted glances and unspoken words. My mother continued sweeping the floor that would never be clean. My father and brother continued leaving in the morning and returning at night. And I learned to hide better. I discovered that the cherry tree in the yard had strong branches that could support my thin weight. When I felt the storm approaching, when I heard their footsteps returning from the bar, when I smelled whiskey in the air, I would climb that tree and stay there, quiet among the leaves, until the danger passed or until sleep overcame me. It was on one of those nights, hidden high in the cherry tree, that I saw something I never forgot. My mother came out to the yard, alone, when everyone thought she was sleeping. She looked at the starry sky for a while, then knelt on the ground and began to cry. A silent cry, with trembling shoulders and hands clutching her own chest. She cried for almost an hour, alone in the dark, without making a single sound. For the first time, I felt something like pity for her. I realized that she too was a prisoner in that house, that life. The difference was that she had chosen her chains, or at least accepted that someone put them on her wrists. I would not accept mine. That same night, among the branches of the cherry tree, I made a promise to the stars. One day, I would leave that house. I didn't know how or where to, but I would leave. And never, ever would I allow anyone to make me feel I was worth less than a mattress again. I began to plan my escape, even without knowing exactly what that meant. I was 13, with no money, nowhere to go. The furthest I had been from Tupelo was once, at age 7, when my father took us to Memphis to visit a relative. I vaguely remembered busy streets, people walking quickly, a sense of vastness that both scared and fascinated me. The idea of running away to a big city like Atlanta terrified me almost as much as the idea of staying. But I had to start somehow. I began collecting coins I found forgotten around the house. A penny here, another there. I kept everything in a hole I dug under the cherry tree, wrapped in a piece of cloth. Weeks passed, then months. The routine remained the same. During the day, it was as if nothing had happened. My father would return for lunch, eat in silence, then take a nap in the hammock on the porch. My brother, increasingly like him, began to bring friends home. Loud boys who looked at me in a way that made me freeze inside. The nights were the worst. I couldn't always escape to the cherry tree. Sometimes, heavy rain forced me to stay inside. Sometimes, my father locked the back door, as if he knew about my hiding place. On those nights, all I could do was curl up in my corner, pray quietly, and hope they would forget about me. They didn't always forget. It was on one of those nights, almost a year after that first time, that something different happened. My father and brother had gone to the bar as usual. My mother was in the kitchen, arranging pots with that obsessive care she had for household things. I was in my corner, mending an old blouse, when I heard a knock at the front door. Visitors were rare at our house, especially at night. My mother went to answer, wiping her hands on her apron as if the person could see the imaginary dirt she was always fighting. It was Aunt Darlene. My aunt who had run away with a musician almost 20 years ago, whom we had never seen again, who was mentioned at home only as an example of what happens to shameless women. She was there, standing at our door, with a small suitcase in her hand and a colorful dress that seemed out of place in Tupelo. "Good evening, Josephine," she said, her voice firmer than I had imagined. My mother was paralyzed for a moment, as if she had seen a ghost. Then she quickly looked behind her to make sure my father wasn't around. "What are you doing here, Darlene?" she whispered, almost afraid. "I came to see Mama. I heard she's not well." Grandma Nellie lived on a small farm on the outskirts of Tupelo. It had been months since we had seen her. My father didn't like visits to her, said that old women only serve to put wrong ideas in girls' heads. "She's very sick," my mother replied, still speaking softly. "The neighbors are taking care of her. You better go straight there. If Joseph finds you here—" "I'm not afraid of your husband, Josephine," Aunt Darlene interrupted. "I never was. That's why I left this town. That's why you should have left too." That's when she saw me, sitting in my corner, watching everything with wide eyes. Something in her gaze changed. A recognition, a sadness, perhaps even guilt for having left her younger sister behind so many years ago. "Is this Clara?" she asked, taking a step into the house even without being invited. My God, how she's grown. The last time I saw her, she was a baby in arms. She approached me, and instinctively I shrank back. I wasn't used to people coming close, especially well-dressed women smelling of perfume. "Hi, Clara. I'm your Aunt Darlene. You probably don't remember me." "She has to leave, Darlene," my mother insisted, nervously looking at the window. Joseph could return at any moment. Aunt Darlene paid no attention. She kept looking at me, now with an expression I couldn't decipher. After a moment, she said something that changed everything. "I'll be staying in town for a few weeks. I'm at the Central Hotel near the church. If you need anything, just look for me there." I looked at her, then at my mother, not understanding what was happening. Why was this aunt I had never seen before telling me where to find her? What did she mean by, "if you need anything"? My mother practically pushed Aunt Darlene out, murmuring apologies and looking at the empty street, as if expecting to see my father turning the corner at any moment. Before leaving, Aunt Darlene looked at me one last time and said, in a low but clear tone, "Remember, Central Hotel. Ask for Darlene Rogers. I don't use the Thompson name anymore." And just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. My mother closed the door forcefully, leaned her back against it as if wanting to prevent any part of that visit from entering our house. "Forget what you saw," she said without looking at me. "Forget what she said. Your aunt has always been the family's problem. I don't want you getting ideas about following in her footsteps." But it was too late. The seed had already been planted. There was a world out there. There was a woman who had escaped from Tupelo, who had left behind the Thompson name, who wore colorful dresses and perfume. A woman who wasn't afraid of Joseph. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake looking at the ceiling, thinking about the Central Hotel, about Aunt Darlene, about possibilities I had never considered before. My small treasure buried under the cherry tree wouldn't be enough for a bus ticket to Atlanta, but perhaps it would be enough to take me to the Central Hotel to find out what my Aunt Darlene had to say. When I finally fell asleep, I didn't dream of birds flying away. I dreamed of doors opening. The following days were different. There was a new energy inside me, a purpose. I observed the routine of the house with more attentive eyes, looking for patterns, moments when I could leave without being noticed. I began to save small things I could take with me. A broken comb, a handkerchief that had belonged to Grandma Nellie, the needle and thread I used to mend clothes. My mother seemed nervous, more agitated than normal. She cleaned the house with even more fury, as if wanting to erase any trace of Aunt Darlene's visit. My father didn't seem to have noticed anything different, thank God. He continued his usual routine: mill, lunch, mill, bar, home. It was on a Tuesday, almost 2 weeks after Aunt Darlene's visit, that the opportunity arose. My father had gone to Memphis to resolve some problem at the mill. He wouldn't return until the next day. My brother was working an extra shift, and my mother needed to go to the market to buy beans and flour. "You stay home," she said, picking up the straw bag she used for shopping. "Finish washing those clothes. I'll be back before lunch." I nodded obediently, as I always did. But as soon as she turned the corner, I ran to the yard. I dug up my little treasure. It was just a few dollars, but it represented months of careful saving. I took Grandma Nellie's handkerchief, the needle and thread, the broken comb. I tied everything in a piece of cloth, along with the least worn-out dress I had and a change of underwear. I looked at the house one last time. Those plaster walls, that dirt floor my mother never managed to get really clean. The wood stove where she prepared food that never had taste. The corner separated by a sheet that had been my world for almost 14 years. I felt nothing. No sadness, no relief, no fear. It was as if I were looking at a stranger's house. I left through the back, passing by the cherry tree that had been my refuge so many nights. I picked a ripe fruit, put it in my mouth. The sweet and sour taste at the same time reminded me that I was still alive, that I could still feel something beyond pain and fear. Tupelo wasn't a big city, but that day it seemed immense. I walked quickly, head down, avoiding looking at people passing by. At any moment I could meet someone who recognized me, Who would ask why I wasn't at home? Who would tell my mother or my father? The Central Hotel was on a corner near the main church. It wasn't really a hotel, but a simple boarding house with a faded sign. I entered with my heart beating so hard I thought people could hear it. The reception was just a wooden counter with a bell. I rang the bell with trembling fingers. A gray-haired lady appeared, looking at me with curiosity. "Yes, my child?" I'm looking for Darlene Rogers," I managed to say, my voice almost disappearing. "She's my aunt." The lady examined me for a moment, perhaps evaluating if I was telling the truth. Then she pointed to a narrow staircase in the back. "Room 3, end of the hall. She should be there now." I climbed the stairs with wobbly legs. The corridor was dark, illuminated only by a small window at the end. I stopped in front of the door with the number 3 hand-painted on it. I raised my hand to knock, but hesitated. What if Aunt Darlene didn't want to see me? What if she had said that just out of politeness? What if... The door opened before I could knock. Aunt Darlene was there, wearing a light blue dress and with her hair tied in an elegant bun, so different from my mother's severe bun. "Clara," she said, not seeming surprised. "I was expecting you." I entered the small but clean room. It had a single bed, a wooden wardrobe, a small table with a water pitcher and glasses. On the wall, a picture with the image of Our Lady of Mercy, the patron saint of Tupelo. "Sit down," she indicated the only chair. I sat, holding my small bundle of belongings against my chest as if it were a shield. "Does your mother know you're here?" she asked, although her tone suggested she already knew the answer. I shook my head negatively. "She went to the market. It won't take her long to realize I've run away." Aunt Darlene nodded, then sat on the edge of the bed, facing me. For a few moments, she just observed me, as if trying to see something beyond the thin and frightened girl that I was. "Clara, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." She hesitated, then continued. "Your father, does he hurt you?" The question was simple, direct, but no one had ever asked me this before. No one had ever even suggested that what happened in our house wasn't normal, wasn't right. The words got stuck in my throat. How to explain? How to put into words the horror of the nights, the blood on the mattress, the hands that should protect and instead destroyed? I couldn't speak. I just nodded, eyes fixed on the floor. Aunt Darlene sighed deeply, then did something that surprised me. She knelt in front of me, took my hands in hers. "Forgive me," she said, her voice breaking. "Forgive me for leaving you and your mother there. I should have come back sooner. I should have checked." "You couldn't have known," I replied, finally finding my voice. "Nobody knows what happens in the Blue House. Nobody wants to know." She squeezed my hands harder. "Now I know, and you're not going back there." It was as if a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Tears I didn't know I was holding back began to run down my face. They weren't tears of sadness, but of something like relief. For the first time in my life, someone was seeing me. Really seeing me. "What are we going to do?" I asked, wiping the tears with the sleeve of my blouse. "They'll look for me. My father will be furious." "We're not staying in Tupelo," Aunt Darlene answered, getting up and going to the wardrobe. She opened it and began to take out her clothes, putting them in an open suitcase on the bed. "We're going to Atlanta today. I have a small apartment there, near Peachtree Street. It's not much, but it has space for both of us." "Atlanta?" The word sounded magical in my mouth. The capital, the big city, the place I only knew from stories. "You live in Atlanta?" "Yes, for many years now. I work in a clothing store downtown. The owner, Mr. Albert, is a good man. I'm sure he can arrange something for you when you're a bit older. For now, you'll study. Complete at least elementary school. Study." The word was almost as magical as Atlanta. It had been years since I had been in a school. The idea of going back to learning, of having books, notebooks, colored pencils perhaps, filled me with an excitement I had never felt before. Aunt Darlene continued arranging her things, talking about Atlanta, about her apartment, about how I would like the city. I just listened, trying to absorb that sudden change, that possibility of a future I had never dared to imagine. When she finished packing the suitcase, she sat down again by my side. "There's a bus to Atlanta at 2 in the afternoon. If we leave now, we'll catch it without a problem. But first, Clara, I need to be sure. Is this really what you want? To come with me? To leave Tupelo behind? I looked at her, at this woman I barely knew, but who was offering the only thing I had always wanted: a way out, an open door, a chance. Yes, I answered, without hesitation. It's all I want. She smiled, a smile that reached her eyes, so different from my mother's fake smiles. Then let's go. Your new life begins today. When we left the Central Hotel, the sun was high in the sky. The streets of Tupelo seemed different now, less threatening, less oppressive. They were just streets of a small town that would soon be left behind. On the way to the bus station, we passed near the market. For an instant, I thought I saw my mother among the fruit stalls. I quickly turned my face, squeezed Aunt Darlene's hand harder. She seemed to understand, quickened her pace. The Tupelo bus station was just a yard with a few platforms and a ticket office. Aunt Darlene bought our tickets, and we sat on a bench to wait for the bus. "Are you nervous?" she asked, noticing how I couldn't stop moving my legs. "A little," I admitted. "What if he comes after us? What if—" "Your father won't find us," she said firmly. "Atlanta is too big, and even if he tried, I wouldn't let him take you back. Never again." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that there was a place where my father couldn't reach me, where his hands couldn't touch me, where his voice wouldn't echo in my nightmare nights. When the bus finally arrived, I climbed the steps with trembling legs. I sat by the window, with Aunt Darlene beside me. As the engine roared and the vehicle began to move, I looked for the last time at the town that had been my prison for almost 14 years. The colorful houses of Tupelo were left behind. The main church, the cobblestone streets, the Tombigbee River that cut through the town. Somewhere there was the blue house, with its yard where a cherry tree grew strong, where a small treasure now forgotten remained buried. I felt no sadness seeing it all disappear. I felt something different, something I took a while to recognize because I had never felt it before. Hope. "Everything will be fine now," Aunt Darlene said, placing her hand over mine. "I promise." As the bus climbed the road leading out of Tupelo, I looked at the sky through the window. It was blue, without a single cloud. I thought of the little birds in Grandma Nellie's stories, of the dreams I had of flying far away. I no longer needed those dreams. I was really flying now, leaving behind the house where I learned that, for some people, I was worth less than a stained mattress. Going to a place where, perhaps, I could discover how much I was really worth. Arriving in Atlanta was like stepping onto another planet. I'll never forget that late afternoon, the bus going down Peachtree Street, and me glued to the window seeing skyscrapers for the first time. Buildings so tall, so immense, that they made my eyes hurt. It seemed that the world had suddenly opened up, showing that it was much bigger than I had ever imagined inside that blue house in Tupelo. "This is Atlanta, Clara," Aunt Darlene said, pointing to that immensity of buildings. "Tomorrow we'll take you to Centennial Park to see the fountains." Aunt Darlene's apartment was in an old building in Midtown, close to Piedmont Park. It was small, a living room kitchen, a bedroom, and a bathroom. But to me, it seemed like a palace. It had ceramic tile floors, not packed dirt. It had a real refrigerator, not just an icebox. It had running water that came out hot from the shower, a marvel I had never experienced before. That first night, lying on a mattress on the living room floor, Aunt Darlene insisted I take the bed, but I refused. I couldn't sleep, not out of fear, as happened in Tupelo, but from excitement. I was in Atlanta. I was free. I was with someone who cared about me, who didn't see me as a burden or an object. The feeling was so strange, so new, that my body didn't know how to process it. The first days were filled with discoveries. Aunt Darlene took me to see Centennial Park, as promised. Walking through the fountains, feeling the water splash on my feet, hearing the sounds of the city. Everything seemed like a dream. I also got to know Piedmont Park, underground Atlanta, the Fox Theater with its golden decorations and colorful facades. I rode a bus for the first time, saw more cars than I had ever seen in my whole life, heard different accents, different music, saw people of all types and colors. It was as if I had been living until then in a black and white world, and suddenly someone had turned on the colors. Aunt Darlene worked in a women's clothing store downtown. The owner, Mr. Albert, was an elderly gentleman with white hair and a heavy New York accent that made me smile. He had a daughter my age who already lived in California, so he treated me with special kindness, almost fatherly. "This girl needs to study, Darlene," he said one day when Aunt Darlene took me to the store. "A smart girl like her, without education, is a waste." And so, just 2 weeks after arriving in Atlanta, I found myself enrolled in a public school near home. I was very behind for my age. At almost 14, I had only completed 2nd grade before my father took me out of school in Tupelo. I was placed in a class with 9 and 10-year-old children, which was humiliating, but I didn't care. I was studying again. I had new notebooks, colored pencils, books. I could learn, grow, dream. The first weeks at school were difficult. I wasn't used to being around other children, to speaking in public, to raising my hand to answer questions. My shyness was so great that the teachers thought I had some problem. One of them even asked Aunt Darlene if I was normal. "She's more normal than many people I know," Aunt Darlene replied, with that firmness I admired so much. "She just needs time and patience." And time was what I had. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Atlanta ceased to be a strange and intimidating place and began to become my home. I learned to walk alone through the neighborhood streets, to take the bus to school, to buy bread at the corner bakery. Simple things that for another girl would be trivial, but for me represented a freedom I had never known. Aunt Darlene enrolled me in an accelerated school program so I could catch up on the lost years. I studied double, did extra lessons at night, on weekends read books borrowed from the public library. I discovered that I loved to learn, that my mind was like a sponge thirsty for knowledge. In particular, I fell in love with history and geography. Knowing about distant places, ancient times, made me feel part of something bigger than my own small life. But not everything was rosy. At night, when the lights went out, the nightmares came. I dreamed of the blue house in Tupelo, of my father entering my room, of the blood-stained mattress, of my mother's cold words. I would wake up screaming, sweaty, my heart beating so hard it seemed it would explode. Aunt Darlene always came to help me in these moments. She would sit beside me, stroke my hair, sing softly until I calmed down. She never asked about the nightmares, waited for me to speak when I was ready. And for a long time, I wasn't. How to talk about the horror? How to put into words what I had lived through? The marks left were not just on the soul, but on the body too. I had scars I couldn't explain, pains that came and went without apparent reason. The doctors Aunt Darlene took me to said I had health issues, a euphemism for the consequences of prolonged abuse. 6 months after arriving in Atlanta, I received news that changed everything again. Grandma Nellie had passed away. Aunt Darlene received a telegram from a neighbor of the farm where she lived. She died in her sleep, peacefully, according to the neighbor. We didn't have the courage to return to Tupelo for the funeral. The fear of meeting my father, my mother, my brother was too great. Instead, Aunt Darlene took flowers to Piedmont Park and laid them by a tree. "So, they reach her, wherever she is," she explained. It was our way of saying goodbye to the grandma who had filled my childhood with stories about princesses who escaped from castles, about girls who turned into little birds. It was after Grandma Nellie's death that I finally began to talk about what I had lived through. Not all at once, but in pieces, in fragments that emerged in night conversations with Aunt Darlene. I talked about the constant fear, about the nights hidden in the cherry tree, about the hands that hurt instead of protect. And finally, a year after arriving in Atlanta, I told about that night. The night of the stained mattress, the night I discovered that to my own mother, I was worth less than an object. Aunt Darlene cried when she heard this part. She cried in a way I had never seen an adult cry, with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. When she finally calmed down, she held my hands and said something I carry with me to this day. "Clara, I want you to understand something. The value of a person is not determined by how others treat them. Your father, your mother, your brother, they don't define who you are or how much you're worth. You are valuable simply for being you, for existing, for breathing. No one can take that away from you." Simple words, but they fell like water on dry land. It was the first time someone clearly told me that I had value simply for being who I was. Not for what I did, not for obeying, Not for keeping quiet and invisible, just for being Clara. Time continued to pass. I turned 15, then 16. I advanced rapidly in my studies, skipping grades thanks to the acceleration program and my own effort. I began to work part-time in Mr. Albert's store, learning the business, earning my own money, small amounts, but which I saved proudly in a little bird-shaped piggy bank that Aunt Darlene gave me. Atlanta grew along with me. The city was expanding, new neighborhoods were emerging, the streets were filling with cars. We were in the early 60s. America was experiencing times of change. We heard on the radio about the civil rights movement, about JFK's assassination, about the political tensions growing in the country. Aunt Darlene had always been a politically engaged woman. She participated in union meetings, read newspapers, discussed politics with friends who frequented our home. Through her, I began to understand the world beyond my own experiences. I began to see how the personal was political, how my story wasn't just mine, but part of a larger system that allowed men like my father to do as they pleased inside their homes, protected by society's indifference. It was around this time, when I was 17, that I met Anthony. He worked in a bookstore near Mr. Albert's shop, a quiet boy with round glasses and always messy hair. He began to lend me books, novels, poetry, political essays. We would talk about what I read, sitting on the steps of the bookstore after closing time. At first, it was just that, conversations about books, about ideas, but gradually, something more grew, an affection, a connection that both scared and fascinated me. Anthony was different from any man I had known, gentle, respectful. He never invaded my space, never touched me without permission. When he finally gathered the courage to invite me to the movies, I panicked. The idea of being alone with a man, even one like Anthony, terrified me. The ghosts of Tupelo were still very real, very present. I told Aunt Darlene about the invitation, about my fear. She listened attentively, then said something that surprised me. "Clara, you have every right to say no. You have every right to never want proximity with any man in your life. What you lived through would justify that. But you also have the right to try, to risk, to discover that not all men are like your father and brother. The choice is yours, and whatever it is, I will support you." I thought a lot about those words. For days I turned the question over in my head. Part of me wanted to say yes, wanted to get to know Anthony better, wanted to experience something I had never had, a relationship based on mutual respect, on gentleness. Another part trembled just thinking about being vulnerable again, about trusting, about opening up. Finally, I decided to risk it. I said yes to the movie invitation with one condition, that Aunt Darlene accompany us the first time. Anthony accepted without hesitation, understanding my fear without needing an explanation. That's how, on a Saturday night in 1964, I had my first date. The movie was To Kill a Mockingbird, based on the book by Harper Lee that Anthony had lent me weeks before. Aunt Darlene sat a few rows behind us, distant enough to give us privacy, close enough to give me security. During the movie, at a particularly sad moment, Anthony held my hand. A simple, innocent gesture, but one that meant a world of trust to me. I didn't withdraw my hand. I let it stay there, feeling the warmth of his fingers intertwined with mine, a new sensation that brought no fear, just a gentle warmth in my chest. Oh, folks, excuse this romantic detour from this old lady. Sometimes I get excited remembering those times. Are you enjoying the story? Leave in the comments if you're following along and what city you're watching from. This old lady gets curious. Going back, that period in Atlanta was one of discovery, not just of the outside world, but of myself. I discovered I could be more than a victim, more than the frightened girl from the blue house. I could be a student, a worker, a friend, maybe even a girlfriend. I could be Clara, not Clara defined by what had been done to me, but Clara who I myself chose to be. But life never follows a straight path without obstacles. In April 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis. The streets of Atlanta filled with mourners and protesters. The universities were in upheaval. People began to march. Anthony, who was a law student and participated in the civil rights movement, had to be careful for a while. Aunt Darlene, always politically engaged, became apprehensive. She was careful about what she said and where she said it. The climate of fear that settled in the country reminded me, in a way, of the climate of the Blue House, never knowing when something bad would happen, never knowing if what you said could provoke a storm. It was in this turbulent context that I received the first and only direct news from Tupelo, almost 3 years after having run away. A letter addressed to Aunt Darlene, but clearly intended for me. I would recognize the handwriting anywhere. It was my mother's. The letter was short, written on lined notebook paper. "Darlene, I know the girl is with you. Joseph found out. He's furious. Says he'll come get her back, that she's his property. Be careful. Josephine." No, how are you? No, hope you're well. No demonstration of concern for me. Just the cold warning, the use of the word property that said everything about how my father saw me. The fear returned with full force. I spent days without sleeping properly, looking at the apartment door as if at any moment it would be broken down and my father would appear there, with those eyes that haunted me in nightmares. I stopped going to school, working at the store, meeting Anthony. I went back to hiding, as I did in the cherry tree. Aunt Darlene, sensing my terror, made a radical decision. She quit her job at the store, sold what she could from the apartment, and a week after the letter, we were on a bus to New York City. "Atlanta is no longer safe for us," she explained. "Your father has acquaintances here. He can find us. In New York, we'll be just 2 among millions. He'll never find us there." The trip to New York was long and tiring. 3 days on the road, sleeping seated, eating at roadside stops. But each mile that took us away from Atlanta, and, by extension, from Tupelo, was 1 more mile of safety. We arrived in New York on a Sunday morning. The city was even bigger, even more intimidating than Atlanta. Imposing buildings, crowded streets, skyscrapers that made your neck hurt from looking up so much. People's accents were different, the pace of life faster, the heat more stifling. Aunt Darlene had a friend who lived in Brooklyn, Mrs. Bernice, who took us in during the first weeks. It was a tiny apartment where we slept on mattresses on the living room floor. But it was safe. It was far from Tupelo. It was a new beginning. Finding work was more difficult in New York. Aunt Darlene finally got a position as a saleswoman in a department store in Manhattan. The salary was lower than in Atlanta, the conditions worse, but it was what we had. I, at almost 18, also needed to work. Studies would take a back seat for a while. Survival came first. I got a job as a counter clerk in a bakery near where we lived. I woke up at 4 in the morning, returned in the late afternoon with the smell of yeast impregnated in my clothes and flour, even in my hair. After 2 months at Mrs. Bernice's house, we managed to rent a room and kitchen in the back of a house in Queens. It was cramped, with a bathroom we shared with other tenants, but it was our space. We gradually bought the basics: a 2-burner stove, a small refrigerator that made a strange noise, 2 single beds. Life in New York was hard, but free. Free from constant fear, free from the shadow of my father, free from the memories that each corner of Atlanta had begun to accumulate. It was a complete fresh start, in a city where nobody knew us, where we could be whoever we wanted. I missed Anthony, our conversations about books, the gentle touch of his hand on mine. We exchanged a few letters in the first months, but distance and circumstances cooled what had barely begun to blossom. The last letter I received from him told me he had been accepted to Yale Law School, that he was moving there, that maybe one day our paths would cross again. In New York, with my 18th birthday just completed, I began to build a new identity. I was no longer just the girl who fled the Blue House, the survivor. I was Clara, a young worker, studious, I went back to studying at night, with dreams and plans for the future. One of those dreams was to have my own business one day. Something small, perhaps, but mine. The idea began to form while I worked at the bakery. I observed how everything worked, how customers came not just for bread, but for coffee, for chatting, for the welcoming environment. Aunt Darlene supported my dreams, as always. "You have a good head for business, Clara," she would say. "Remember how you organized the shelves in Mr. Albert's store? How he always praised your way with customers? It will work out, you'll see." The years in New York passed quickly. Hard work, night studies, the daily struggle to save every penny we could. We moved to a slightly larger apartment in Queens with a room for each of us. Aunt Darlene got a better job in a fine fabric store in Manhattan. I continued at the bakery, now as a manager, responsible for the entire morning shift operation. It was in New York also that I met George, a young man who worked delivering bread to the bakery. He was older than me, 25 when we met. A simple, hard-working man with an easy smile and gentle eyes. We began to talk during deliveries. Then he started waiting for me at the end of my shift, accompanying me to the bus stop. The shadow of Tupelo still hung over me. I still had nightmares, still tensed when a man came too close, still had days when I couldn't bear to be touched. But George was patient, respected my boundaries, never pressured me for anything. Our courtship was slow, cautious. It took me almost a year to allow more than kisses and hugs. George never complained, never demanded explanations I wasn't ready to give. He accepted my silences, my hesitations, my moments of withdrawal. Aunt Darlene liked him. "He's a decent man," she would say. "The kind that builds, not destroys." When I turned 21 in 1968, George asked me to marry him. I panicked initially. Getting married meant living with a man, sleeping in the same bed, being vulnerable in a way I had sworn never to be again. I asked for time to think, and he respected that, as always. It was a difficult decision, which involved many conversations with Aunt Darlene, many sleepless nights, many tears shed remembering the past. But finally, I decided that I couldn't let what happened in the Blue House determine my entire life. I couldn't let my father, even at a distance, continue to control my choices, my fears, my limitations. I said yes to George, with some conditions. That Aunt Darlene would live with us, at least in the beginning. That we would have separate rooms until I felt ready for more. That he promised never, ever, to raise his voice or hand to me, no matter the reason. He accepted everything, without questioning. "I just want you in my life, Clara," he said simply, "in whatever way you can be." We got married in a small ceremony at the courthouse, with only Aunt Darlene and a few friends as witnesses. No church, no party, we didn't have money for that, and I didn't care. What mattered was the commitment, the mutual promise of care and respect. We rented a small apartment in Queens, with 2 bedrooms, one for us, another for Aunt Darlene. As promised, George never pressured me. We slept in separate beds in the same room, an arrangement many would find strange, but which worked for us. It was only 6 months after the wedding that I finally felt ready for greater intimacy. It wasn't easy. The ghosts of Tupelo appeared at the most unexpected moments, making my body freeze, my mind panic. But George was patient, gentle, always giving me control over what happened, when it happened, how it happened. Gradually, I discovered that intimacy could be something beautiful, pleasurable, based on mutual trust, that my body, that same body that had been violated so many times, could be a source of good sensations, of genuine connection with someone who truly cared about me. It was like a slow, gradual healing of the invisible wounds I carried. Not a complete cure. Some scars never completely disappear, but a reconciliation with my own being, a recovery of control over my life, my body, my story. Life followed its course. I continued working at the bakery, now as general manager. George was promoted to delivery supervisor of the bakery that supplied several shops in Queens. Aunt Darlene continued at the fabric store, but was already talking about retiring, about going back to the South. Not to Tupelo, never there, but maybe to Atlanta, from where she kept good memories. The dream of having my own business remained alive. Together with George, we saved every penny we could. The plan was to open a small grocery store, selling fruits, vegetables, and basic products. Something simple to start with, that we could expand over time. In 1970, our dream finally began to materialize. We found a small commercial spot on a busy street in Queens. The rent was high, but the location made up for it. With our savings and a loan that George got from his boss, we opened Clara's Market. The beginning was difficult, as all business beginnings are. We worked from sunrise to sunset, me in front attending to customers, George in the back organizing stock and making deliveries. But gradually, we won over the local clientele. My attentive way with customers, remembering names, Asking about family, suggesting products, made a difference. People came back, brought friends, spread the word. In 1972, Aunt Darlene decided to return to Atlanta. It was a painful goodbye. She had been my savior, my family, my safe harbor for almost 10 years. But I understood her desire to return to the city she loved, now that I was established, married, with my own business. "You did it, Clara," she told me at the airport, holding my hands as she had done so many times over the years. "Look at you, strong, independent, owner of your own path. I'm so proud of the woman you've become." I cried a lot that day, watching the plane take off, carrying the person who had risked everything to save me. But it wasn't a definitive goodbye. We promised to visit each other regularly, to keep in touch by letters and phone calls. Life followed its course, with ups and downs, like all lives. The market prospered. We managed to buy the space a few years later. We expanded to grocery products, then to a small cafe in the back of the store. George and I worked side by side, building not just a business, but a life together. We never had children. The doctors said that the abuse I suffered in adolescence had left sequelae that made pregnancy difficult, risky. At first, this saddened me deeply. It seemed that my father and brother continued to take things from me, even after so many years, even miles away. But over time, I accepted this reality. The market became our child, the business we created and nurtured together. And George's nephews, children of his younger sister, filled our house with laughter and mess on weekends, bringing the joy of children to our lives. I never returned to Tupelo. Never saw my father, my mother, my brother again. I don't know if they're still alive, if they still live in the Blue House, if they ever wondered what happened to me, if they missed me. Part of me hopes so, not out of revenge, but because it would mean that somehow I mattered, even if briefly. Aunt Darlene told me, years after returning to Atlanta, that she heard rumors about the Thompson family of the Blue House, that the eldest son had become just like his father, a drunk and violent man, that the mother had aged before her time, still sweeping the dirt floor as if she could transform it into marble, that the father had died of cirrhosis, alone in a hospital bed, with no one to hold his hand. I felt nothing when I heard this news, neither joy, nor sadness, nor relief, nor remorse. It was like hearing about characters from a book I read a long time ago, a book I no longer have any interest in rereading. The years passed. America changed, New York changed, I changed. We lived through the Vietnam War, Watergate, the oil crisis. We saw the economic recessions of the 70s and 80s, the financial plans that never worked out right, the economic boom of the 90s that finally brought some stability. Our market became an institution in the neighborhood. Mrs. Clara from the market, that's how they knew me. The children I served in the first years became adults who brought their own children to buy fruits and savor the coffee that George prepared with such care. Aunt Darlene passed away in 1998, peacefully, during sleep. I went to Atlanta for the funeral, met old friends, visited places that had been important to me, but I no longer felt that connection with the city. My home was New York now, had been for more than 30 years. George left us in 2010, a victim of pancreatic cancer that consumed him quickly. It was the most painful loss of my adult life. The man who had shown me that love could be gentle, that intimacy could be safe, that a marriage could be a partnership of equals, not a prison. I continued with the market for a few more years, then decided to sell. I was tired, with more than 60 years on my back, ready to slow down. I bought a small but comfortable apartment in Manhattan, near Central Park. In the mornings, I walk through the park, observe the greenery that enchanted me when I arrived in New York so many decades ago. Sometimes, when the wind blows a certain way, I smell ripe cherries. I remember the tree in the yard of the Blue House, the branches that sheltered me on so many nights of terror. I think of the girl I was, skinny, frightened, convinced that I wasn't worth even the price of a mattress. And I look at the woman I became. A woman who built a dignified life. A woman who knew true love. A woman who didn't allow her worth to be determined by others. A woman who, despite everything, survived. More than that, lived. This is my story, my dears. It's not a pretty story. It's not an easy story. But it's my story. And if it can help even one person understand that their worth doesn't depend on how others treat them, that there's always a way out, a door, a possibility of starting over, then it was worth sharing it with you. When I look back at the path I've traveled from the girl of the blue house to the woman I am today, I see that each stage of my life was a lesson about my own worth. Leaving Tupelo with Aunt Darlene was the first step. Discovering Atlanta was breathing freedom for the first time. Fleeing to New York was learning that sometimes we need to start over more than once. Meeting George was understanding that not all men are like my father and brother. Opening the market was proving to myself that I could build something from scratch. Each little brick of this construction helped me understand that my worth wasn't in what others said about me, wasn't in my mother's cold words about the stained mattress, wasn't in my father's looks of contempt. My worth was in myself, in my capacity to survive, to start over, to build, to love despite the scars. Aunt Darlene was the first person to show me this. You are valuable simply for being you, for existing, for breathing. No one can take that away from you, she told me once, words I carried with me like a talisman in the most difficult moments. George reinforced this lesson with his patient love, his respect for my boundaries, his unwavering belief in my capabilities. Our market became more than a business. It was the concrete proof of this reconstruction. People didn't come just for the fresh fruit or the tasty coffee that George prepared in the back. They came because they felt something special in that place. The care, the respect, the genuine attention we gave to each customer. We treated everyone as people of value, because we had learned how much that matters. We didn't have biological children, it's true. The doctors confirmed what I already feared. The abuse suffered in adolescence had left permanent physical marks. At first, this saddened me deeply. It seemed that my father and brother continued to take things from me, even years later, even miles away. They not only stole my past, I confided to George one night between sobs, they stole my future too. No, Clara, your future is yours. It always has been. It always will be, he replied, with that simple wisdom that always surprised me. And we can build a family in many ways. And so we did. Our family ended up being the young people who worked with us at the market, many of them newcomers to New York. George's nephews who filled our house with joy on weekends. The elderly customers who no longer had family and found in us a support, a friendly conversation, an attentive ear for their stories. After George's death in 2010, the grief was deep, but different from what I felt when I lost Aunt Darlene. No less painful, but more serene. I had time to prepare, to say everything I needed to say, to thank for every moment. And I had the children and grandchildren that life gave us, not by blood, but by heart. Today, at 78, sitting on the balcony of my Manhattan apartment, looking at the skyline that fascinated me since the first time I saw it when arriving in New York, I feel a peace I never imagined possible for that terrified girl from the blue house. I never went back to Tupelo, never saw my father, my mother, my brother again. I heard from others that my father died of cirrhosis, alone in a hospital bed. That my mother continued in the blue house, increasingly bent, increasingly silent, sweeping the same dirt floor until the end. That my brother followed in my father's footsteps in everything, in the mill, in drinking, in violence. I felt nothing when I heard this news. It was like hearing about characters from a book I read a long time ago, a book I no longer have any interest in rereading. The girl who wasn't worth a mattress transformed into a woman who built an entire life based on value, not material value, although we never went through need, but human value, self-respect, the dignity that no one can take from you when you truly believe in it. If there's one lesson I've learned in all these years, it's that we should never allow others to determine our worth. Not parents, not husbands, not bosses, not strangers on the street. Our worth is intrinsic, comes from within, from our capacity to love, to grow, to help, to build something meaningful in the world. And I also learned that there's always a way out. Always. Even in the most desperate, darkest situations, there's a door that opens, a path that appears, a hand that extends. Sometimes we need courage to see that exit, to believe we deserve something better, to take the first step toward freedom. My dears who followed along until here, This is my story. It's not pretty, it's not easy, but it's mine. And if it can help even one person understand that their worth doesn't depend on what others say or do, that there's always a way out, even from the most desperate situations, that it's possible to rebuild yourself after being broken, then it was worth sharing it. If you liked my story, please leave your like down below and don't forget to subscribe to This Grandma's Heart Gets Warm, knowing there are people on the other side listening to what I have to share. As my grandma Nellie used to say back in Tupelo, life doesn't always give us what we want, but it always teaches us what we need. Thank you for listening to me, my dears. God bless each one of you.